Compared to other villains in Avatar: The Last Airbender and The Legend of Korra, I believe Kuvira is not understood as thoughtfully and comprehensively as she really should be. People I have seen eloquently discuss the belief systems of someone like Zahir and even someone like Amon, and that is all completely justified. Those are fascinating characters, especially Zahir, who deserve the philosophical discussions that they have received. But Kuvira, I think, has been underappreciated in this regard. She typically prompts one of two reactions. The first being, oh, she wants to take over the world, so she's basically the same as Ozai and Azula in Avatar: The Last Airbender, and is thus not worth the kind of close philosophical consideration other characters in Korra have received. Or else, the other reaction is, oh, she's a fascist. She is based on fascism of the 1920s and 30s, and as such, I will just apply what I already know about fascism to Kuvira's character and call that an analysis. And I think both of these approaches are a little short-sighted. Yes, Kuvira is, to a large extent, based on fascist ideology. I am not here to dispute that. But I do think that the word fascism, too often these days, displaces any kind of real discussion about what a figure believes and what a figure really wants. Fascism is an overused term, especially when it is applied to contemporary political figures who do not directly call themselves fascist, because it's an easy way to dismiss someone that you don't like. You say, oh, hey, they're a fascist, so they are not worth engaging with, and they and all their supporters are people who should be resented. And it can be quite annoying as someone who, actually cares what words mean. Because if you object to X political figures being called a fascist, people say, oh, you're defending them? And oftentimes, no, I have no desire to defend the kinds of people who typically get called fascists, but there is a difference between fascism and authoritarianism or totalitarianism. I am going to use it when talking about Kuvira, since she is directly based off the fascist leaders of the time period that Korra is set in. But it's a term that I'm a bit uncomfortable with because of how broadly it's often used without a lot of clear and precise analysis. Kuvira is often compared to, say, Hitler or Mussolini, since those are the fascist figures that Americans are most familiar with. But the figure that she most resembles, actually, in terms of history, is Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Nationalist Party of China during this time. Unlike Hitler and Mussolini, Chiang Kai-shek is not universally despised, and especially in Taiwan, there is still a lot of appreciation for the figures, so I am going to tread a bit lightly here. But I want to be clear that Chiang Kai-shek very much did associate himself with the European fascist movement of the time. His followers were called blue shirts, as an obvious reference to your black shirts and your brown shirts. Chiang Kai-shek could also be quite brutal, especially toward dissenters. He killed and imprisoned a very large amount of left-wing sympathizers during his time as the leader of China during the nationalist era. For those who aren't at all familiar with Chinese history, the nationalist era is complicated, but the most basic way to describe it is that it's the time between the fall of the Chinese imperial state and the victory of the Chinese Communist Party at the end of the Chinese Civil War. More specifically, the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, in its incarnation under Chiang Kai-shek, took power in the mid to late 1920s as a result of the Northern Expedition of military conquest that united a China that had fallen into a series of fractured fiefdoms after the fall of the Qing dynasty, and especially after the failure of the government of Yuan Shikai, an early nationalist leader. Kuvira is obviously similar to Chiang Kai-shek in that she is a hyper-militarist leader of China, the Earth Kingdom, after the fall of the last imperial dynasty. But she's also a figure who parallels him in that her actions are quite ambivalent. Like, there are things that one can really respect about Kuvira, and there are things that one can really despise about Kuvira. The things that people despise about her, such as her aggressive expansionism, her cruel treatment of dissenters, and her creation of herself as a kind of dictator who unites, indeed, these disparate groups of people, but does so in a very cruel and authoritative way. But she also does a lot of good, as difficult as that might be for a lot of us to accept. She does unite this fractured country. She modernizes it. She brings in new forms of organization, new forms of military discipline, new forms of basically constructing a state to make it more efficient and more capable of establishing its authority over the area it controls. The Earth Kingdom was not a very centralized country. Ba Sing Se, while it is the ostensible seat of power, does not actually have a lot of control over the regions outside the major capital. Kuvira fundamentally changes that through a system of infrastructure and through a system of modern, rationalized, scientific organization. She creates a modern state, more or less, out of the ruins of the old. is able to consolidate her power and authority and interlink her nation to a degree that the old imperial state was very much not united or interlinked. And the same is true to a lesser extent of Chiang Kai-shek. He was not as successful at consolidating his power over a wide series of areas as Kuvira, and Chiang Kai-shek had to make agreements with a lot of these local warlords that had taken power after the fall of the Qing dynasty in order to maintain his power. But nonetheless, he did modernize the state. He modernized its industry, he modernized its commerce. He did what the imperial government before him tried to do but failed. China, after a disastrous series of wars with the Europeans that I do not have time to go into, very much realized that this was going to keep happening if the country stayed backward, if it stayed technologically impoverished and rather decentralized, incapable of exerting its authority, incapable of really collecting the taxes it needed to run itself as a robust organization, incapable of building the infrastructure it needed to sustain itself, particularly in a time of vast and quite dizzying population growth. The government knew reform was necessary, particularly in terms of its military organization and particularly in terms of its technology. Everything was run on a rather pre-modern Confucian model that prioritized morality and a paternalist structure between the leaders of states and the government as a whole, instead of the modern, scientific, efficient, utilitarian, rationalized state structure that you see spreading throughout Europe in the 19th century. But ultimately, the reformers were outnumbered and unable to exert the same kind of transformative power that you see in a place like Japan, which succeeded at transforming itself into a modern, rationalized, centralized state. Chiang Kai-shek, taking over in the ruins of the fallen empire, is able to achieve that sense of centralization of state power to a degree, and as such form a modern Chinese nation state, albeit one that was rather weak and only questionably loyal to him, especially as his popularity declines in the 1940s during the time of the Japanese invasion and after that the Chinese Civil War. There are other parallels to Kuvira. Chiang Kai-shek married the daughter of Charlie Song, who was a very powerful modern industrialist of China during this time of rapid urbanization and transformation of the country into a more modern state. Similarly, Kuvira marries the son of a very powerful and influential family, the Beifongs, who are on the forefront of modern innovation and industry. Chiang Kai-shek went overseas to Japan after Japan had undergone its rapid modernization process in the aftermath of the Meiji Restoration, and he learned a lot of these new ideas of military organization, these new ideas of the nation state, that were becoming very popular in Japan. It was a more scientific model for running a country. He very much brought these influences of the new industrial world back with him when he left Japan, went back to China, and established the Whampoa Military Academy, which trained soldiers in these new modern methods of combat and military organization. These new ideas were a major reason why the Kuomintang under Chiang Kai-shek was able to attain a degree of centralized power that the faltering Qing state before him very much could not. So there are a lot of parallels to Kuvira, and not all of them are bad, which makes thinking about the influence of Chiang Kai-shek a bit murky and a bit ambiguous. And that same ambiguity holds true for Kuvira. Yes, Kuvira does a lot of horrible things. She is ruthless. She is authoritarian. She completely rejects any input that disagrees with her almost godlike authority over her people. And yet, she very much is able to rescue an Earth Kingdom that had fundamentally failed to function, that had broken apart. She reunifies this old, degraded, sickly country using new techniques, using modern technology and modern ideas of governance. The most obvious example of this in terms of Kuvira is the very modern train network that she, helped by Varric, builds across the Earth Kingdom. So Kuvira is both a tyrant and a tireless modernizer. And I think the latter aspect of her character is somewhat overlooked. When she says that she is for progress and equality, it's very easy to be cynical of her, and that cynicism is justified to a certain extent. But in terms of completely eradicating the old order based on the veneration of emperors and nobles, she succeeds in that she does create a more equal, egalitarian state. In terms of modernizing her country, she succeeds brilliantly at that, and she brings economic wealth and a hope for progress and social betterment to a country that has been stuck in a mire of stagnation for centuries. I'm not saying any of this to defend Kuvira, but I think these are nuances important to understand regarding what the show does with her. So thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can, and you want to see more videos like this before anyone else. The more I looked, the more parallels I saw between Kuvira and Chiang Kai-shek. Two militarists, two passionate modernizers, two tyrants, two genuinely concerned patriots. It's hard to come to a perfect and precise conclusion about a figure like Chiang Kai-shek because it was a difficult and chaotic time, and anyone who could create a sense of order deserves some respect. And I think the same is true to an extent in terms of Kuvira. Adios, comrades.